I'd like to say a word now, if I may, about corruption. I think it's very important to make the point that corruption exists in human nature. It is not confined to one country, and if the conditions are there, any society will be corrupt. And if the conditions are there, any society can be made almost incorruptible. It all depends on the cultural conditions and the legal conditions and the consequences that arise if you're found to be corrupt. One of the pieces of legislation that impressed me, I wasn't around at the time, but that impressed me when I came to study this issue of corruption, because we've had quite an amount of controversy about corruption in my own country, in Ireland. We've had very expensive tribunals of inquiry looking into certain payments that were made to politicians, looking into certain changes that were made in the zoning of particular lands, and the suggestion that certain politicians on local authorities had received money in return for this. These tribunals of inquiry were enormously expensive. They were a fantastic bonanza for the legal profession, who represented everybody, both the government and the people who were accused, and eventually they came forth with relatively uncertain conclusions in some respects. So I don't recommend tribunals of inquiry for that reason. But what I do recommend you look at is legislation that was passed in 1916 in the British Parliament during the First World War, the Prevention of Corruption Act. And that act said that if you paid money to anybody who was involved with a munitions contract, which you or your company gained, automatically you had to prove that it wasn't corrupt. So the burden of proof was reversed. Normally, the prosecution has to prove that certain payments or certain relationships were corrupt before any conviction can occur. But in the 1916 legislation, in a very narrow field of endeavour, the then Parliament, and Ireland was part of the UK at that time, and Irish representatives participated in this decision, it was automatically your problem to prove that if you made a particular payment that was defined in the Act, that it wasn't corrupt. Perhaps we could extend that principle of reversing the burden of proof to a wider range of transactions or relationships. And that if such relationships exist, they are automatically deemed to be corrupt unless they can be proven not to be corrupt. Something of that nature might be worth looking at to deal with this problem. Because if there are no consequences for being corrupt, well then people will be corrupt. Another issue that arose in the Irish case about corruption, and it was the cause of one of the tribunals where there were arguments about preferential treatment being given to the supporters of one particular political party or politician in the matter of export credits for the export of beef to different countries. I don't think Nigeria was getting any of this beef, but some of it was going to Iraq and places like that, and it was suggested that there was favoritism. And there were questions asked in Parliament about this before ever the tribunal was set up. And when the tribunal eventually, at great expense, came to examine the thing, it discovered that if the original questions in Parliament had been answered properly, there wouldn't have been any need for a tribunal of inquiry. So what that suggests to me is that the Speaker of the National Assembly, or the Speaker of the House of Commons, or the Ceann Comhairle of Dáil Éireann, that's the Irish equivalent of the Speaker of the House of Commons, that he or she should have a role of checking on appeal whether an answer that was given in Parliament was fully accurate in every respect, and have the capacity to embarrass the government by insisting that the minister who gave an inadequate answer came in and gave a proper answer the second time around. If that power was vigorously used, I think you would root out many of the problems. And Jack Straw gave a very good illustration, which I can testify to from my own experience, of that very often it's only when a parliamentary question is put in that you discover certain things that are happening in your own ministry. Well, if that could be strengthened further, and if embarrassing questions are being asked and where the minister doesn't want to give the answer properly, or where his officials don't want to give the answer properly, and produce one of these clever anodyne answers that really don't answer the question at all, there would be an institution that could come down like a ton of bricks on top of the minister and his civil servants and insist that they answer the question properly. I think that would go a considerable distance as well to cleaning up the administrative system. And I think it's more useful, in fact, than a lot of freedom of information legislation, which is just a media circus a lot of the time, I find in my own country anyway. Now, I want to say something because I know this is a country that is a miracle in a way. I know we're commemorating, I think, the 100th anniversary of the unification of Nigeria, the three parts of Nigeria coming together as one unit. And the fact that that very diverse union has survived is a miracle, really, of great achievement for Nigerian statespeople. And it has been achieved against a background of quite marked religious and political differences. And as I drove here from the airport, I was struck by how religious this country is. The billboards were about religious issues, and indeed, some things were being promised on those billboards that I wouldn't even pray for, but I've no doubt people being better Christians here than I am probably do achieve some of those things as a result of their prayers. But I know that in other parts of the country, and indeed in mixed areas, there are equally strong religious viewpoints that would be very different to that. And you have a Christian and a Muslim difference in this country. We have a similar problem in Northern Ireland, which is now still part of the United Kingdom, but where we are in a situation where somewhere approaching 48% of the population are Catholic, which presumes that they might have a nationalist orientation and want to be governed from Dublin rather than London, and a diminishing majority of the population are Protestant and therefore assumed perhaps to prefer government from London. Now, I think those categories are actually not very indicative of the true opinion of people. I think most people are conservative and don't want to change, and I don't think there will be any change in the near future in the status of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. But nonetheless, there are very, very deep divisions between the people there. And if you drive through Belfast or through Derry, but particularly through Belfast, you'll move from one suburb where the streets are painted in green, white and orange, indicating that these are people living here are nationalists oriented towards Dublin, and you go 50 yards up the road and you suddenly find that the pavement is painted red, white and blue, the colours of the Union Jack, indicating that the people there owe their allegiance to London and to the United Kingdom and Her Majesty the Queen.